Thank
Okay.
you. Kol kavod, Michael. I would
For
have never
those
remembered.
for those who couldn't make it. But thank you all for giving up part of your precious Sundays, which no matter what country you're in is precious. And let's get going. Okay. So what we're seeing here and what we're going to do is we're going to take a hike in the Jezreel Valley. And why are we doing this hike now? Because we just celebrated Purim. And the Megillah of Esther tells the story very beautifully and dramatically. There's a king, there's a queen, there's a power struggle, and there's wine. And although it seems like the king was in charge, in essence, it was really Vashti and Haman, and then Queen Esther and Mordecai, as well as other advisors, who quietly really made things happen. And the wine is always there, albeit in the background. And today's story will actually be similar. So where are we going to be? We are at the meeting point in northern Israel of the Shomron, or Samaria, in the south, and the lower Galilee to the north. To the west is Mount Carmel, and to the east is the area between Mount Gilboa and the Kinneret. And this is known in Hebrew as Emek Yizrael. Our hike is just a short hike, is a half-day hike, pretty easy walk that anybody who can walk can do it. It's not wheelchair accessible though. Hopefully one day it will be. And it starts from the ancient city of Jezreel. Okay, now if you look here, in this circle is pretty much the area of the Jezreel Valley. And Jezreel itself, Israel, is where the red arrow is. And it's at the entrance to the valley. All the important cities are at the entrance to valleys, almost all over Israel. They're at the entrance to valleys, excluding places like Tzfat and Jerusalem. But other than that, when you enter a valley, you want to be in charge of the valley, you need the high place that's at the entrance of one of the ancient roads into the valley. And if you look at the valley here, you can see that there's, from the middle of what is today is a city called Afula, there are roads going like a star in each direction. And when you get to the edge of the valley, then you get to a big city. It could be Jezreel, it could be Megiddo and Yokneam, and it goes on and on. And that's how ancient cities were made around these valleys. In the ancient times, the valleys, of course, were for farming. And you lived up high in a place that you could defend, and you lived where there were rocks. Today, things have changed. People live in the valley because farming is not as important as it was. But this is one of the most fertile valleys, one of the biggest valleys in Israel. And here you can see that the ancient city, or the Tel of Yisrael, is here in the middle of the picture. And the end of our hike is going to be at the spring that was connected to the city, called En Yisrael, the spring, which is down in the valley. In other words, the city sits up on high and protects the entrance to the valley, and the spring is down in the valley. If you look in the background here, these mountains here, that's already the kingdom of Jordan on the other side of the Jordan River. So there's a very important road that goes right next to Yisrael, next to Jezreel. And it's called Via Maris, the way of the sea, the King's Highway. And pretty much it, as you can see here on the left on top, it goes pretty much like the coastal road today. And then when it gets up to the north and it gets up to the Mount Carmel area, it takes a right and goes east, right next to Israel, all the way towards Damascus. And that pretty much is where we are. What does the name mean? Yisrael, which is often mistaken with Israel. Yizra means will plant. El is God's name. Israel, God will plant. So the word Jezreel, of course, is the Englishized version of the Hebrew Yisrael, and the name befits a very fertile valley, the Jezreel Valley. And interesting enough, Emek Yisrael, the Jezreel Valley, was also a cradle for many of the country's first kibbutzim and moshavim. And I remember, and you may remember too, when I was a kid in Sunday school, kindergarten in Kansas, we would sing a song that went like this: Achshav, Achshav, be'emek Yisrael. Tumba, 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 be'emek Yisrael. Everybody sang it, be'emek Yisrael, because we thought that's Israel. And the way it's actually pronounced, but is Yisrael, not Israel, but Israel. And because of that, it's very confusing. It leads to a lot of misunderstandings. I thought we were singing about a valley in Israel. I didn't know from Israel, and the teacher didn't either. And I still haven't figured out why, but this song was taught and sung only in the diaspora. I've asked Israelis for years, young and old, if they've ever heard this song, and nobody has. But when I was a little kid in the early 60s, this was the song to be sung. There was a dance that went with it, which made it even more fun. Tumba is the name of a musical form, but it's also the name of a drum, which apparently inspired the anonymous author of this very strange song. And let's hear it. And it's commonly mispronounced, as the singer will hear, as Emek Yisrael, but it's an interesting song, and it comes from all the pioneers that went to the Jezreel Valley.
Can't hear. Can't hear.
No sound.
Nobody, no sound.
No volume.
Okay, one moment. We'll skip this, but what's important is that it's a song about the Jezreel Valley that made it all the way to Kansas, and what really is important is that this is the breadbasket, okay, of northern Israel, and actually has been for thousands of years. This includes very fertile land, grain storage, as you can see here, areas owned by royal families and governments throughout the ages. In other words, some places were private land. The Jezreel Valley in this area was royal land. We have a number of places around Israel that throughout the ages have been royal land. And it used to be a Canaanite city, and then it became a Jewish city. And then the Arameans, who are from the area of Damascus, destroyed it. In the 4th century, somebody described Israel as a famous place in a big valley. The Crusaders built a fort here in the 11th century. And in the 12th century, something changed. A traveler wrote, Israel is now called Zar'in. It is a Muslim city. There's a village. There's a big spring here. And there's one Jewish man who is a painter. And when he says painter, he doesn't mean an artist. He means somebody who paints houses. It continued to be a Muslim village with a few Jewish residents until the early 19th century. And then the El Hadi family from a nearby village just came in and took it over and expelled everybody else. And during the riots in Israel from 1936 to 1939, the Zar'in residents would shoot down from their village at the Jewish cars and trucks traveling on the road below, which you can see here, goes right through the valley underneath the village. So the village pretty much controls who goes through the valley. But in 1948, all the people of Zar'in ran away. And as opposed to Wikipedia or wherever you read, it wasn't Jewish people who came in and kicked the folks out. It was actually an army that came from Iraq called the Arab Salvation Army, or the Arab Liberation Army, of a man named Fawzi Kaukchi. And he went all over northern Israel and said, guys, get out. We got a war to wage. We will win. And when we finish, you can come back and all the Jewish houses that you see will be yours. So he actually kicked out the people who were living in Zarin and took over so that there were practically no civilians there in 1948. So on the War of Independence, an IDF unit attacked the village and Kaukji's army fled. And there's a memorial at the trailhead to the IDF soldiers who died in this battle. Some of the surviving soldiers decided to build a kibbutz nearby and called it, of course, Israel. This happened in a number of places in Israel. And here's the kibbutz today in the circle right next to Tel Israel. And today they have a very big factory for making robots that clean swimming pools. Go figure, but there they are. So the Fertile Valley in biblical times, as we said, was a breadbasket. But because for thousands of years nobody tilled it, it became a huge swamp known as the Norris Swamps. It was infested, of course, with those famous malaria-carrying mosquitoes. And this is one of the first places where large tracts of land were bought for the Jewish people by a man named the Redeemer of the Valley. This man, who looks more like a prophet than a JNF man, he was known as, his name was Yoshua Hankin, and he bought the Jezreel Valley from a very rich family in Lebanon named the Sursuk family. They're still there in Lebanon, and they sold it for a pretty hefty price to Hankin. That's the man who sold it to him, Sursuk. And of course, why did they want to sell it? It was a swampland. But Yoshua Hankin knew that we had pioneers that were willing to risk their health and their lives to clear the swamps. And that's exactly what they did. And then something amazing happened. After they drained the swamps, they plowed for the first time in thousands of years, if you can imagine this, okay? They sent a JNF photographer to take this picture, which, by the way, we have hanging in our house, because this is an amazing picture. It's incredibly dramatic because it's mainly clouds. You can see Mount Gilboa on the right, very close, and you can see the Kingdom of Jordan way in the back on the left. But look at this very first plowing after thousands of years. Look how many mules and horses they needed, like 20. You usually just need one cow, one ox, one donkey to pull the plow. They've got this gigantic plow and they've got 10 guys standing around when usually it just takes one person, because this was the very first plowing after thousands of years. And I just like looking at this because it's like, it's chutzpah, you know, it's like, it's farming chutzpah. It's saying, I don't care what's here, we can change this. And that's something that's been with the Jewish people and the state of Israel from the beginning. It kind of reminds me what the Jewish people have done, returning to the ancestral home, donating tzedakah to buying the land, because that was bought for the JNF by funds that came from people all over the world. And we all know when we were kids, we put the coins in the JNF box, the blue box. People sacrificed their health and their lives to clear the swamps. And then for some people, it's just holding the plow. But these were all kind of heroes in my eyes. So let's begin our hike today from where the arrow is at Tel Israel. And this kibbutz, as I said, was founded right after the War of Independence, but actually it became famous for something very strange. It was the only kibbutz at the time that refused to have their children sleep alone in the children's house. You've probably heard of this before, but the first kibbutzim had this great idea. I say great, tongue-in-cheek. They decided that in order for there to be very good work production, instead of every group of parents having to wake up at night because their kids woke them up and be exhausted in the morning, they'll simply, as you can see on the picture on the top left, they'll all bring their kids to the children's house at night. They'll say good night and they'll read them a story. All the kids will go to bed at the same time. and the parents will get a good night's sleep. And two parents will, instead of working that week, their job will be to walk around all the children's houses. If anybody wakes up, they'll bring them a glass of water. They'll tell them a story. It's actually a great socialist idea if the most important thing in your life is work, right? But if the most important thing in your life is kids and family, it's not necessarily a healthy thing to take kids away from their parents when perhaps they most need them at night, when things are maybe a little scary, when you may have a nightmare, when you need a glass of water, whatever. So all the kibbutzim did this in the beginning, but Israel was the one who didn't do it. And they were considered a little weird. We find them kind of normal, right? But back then it was not acceptable. My wife, who grew up on a kibbutz and spent a few years in children's houses, didn't think it was so bad. She said it was like a great slumber party. But there was another someone at the kibbutz who said that they felt that they were emotionally damaged because they couldn't get to their parents. But at the time, they thought that this was the best thing to do. And I also know personally from my wife's stories that if she really wanted to get to her parents, she simply opened the window, jumped out, and ran over to her parents' house and spent the night there. So you can kind of cheat. But anyway, today, the very few kibbutzim that are still around in Israel, no children's houses exist. That's a thing of the past. So we could say that Israel was before its time, as far as that goes. So before we begin hiking, a little bit of historical background. 3,000 years ago, about during the time of the first three kings, King Saul, King David, King Solomon, there was what we call the United Monarchy, or one royal government that ruled the entire land of Israel and all 12 tribes, more or less. But after Solomon, we started bickering with each other on a national level, and we split up into two countries, as you can see here. It's kind of embarrassing, right? We got a little tract of land, we have just a few people, but we were infighting so much that we had to make two countries instead of one, which of course, there's a lesson there even today. The kingdom of Judah was in the south, in Jerusalem and the area around it, in the southern part of the country, and the kingdom of Israel, a little bit north of Jerusalem, and all the way up to Dan on today's Lebanese border. The capital of Judah, of course, was Jerusalem, but the kingdom of Israel had a number of capital cities in various times. Sometimes it was Shechem, sometimes it was Tirzah, sometimes it was Shomron or Samaria, as you see here, and sometimes it was Jezreel, or the royal family had a number of cities, and they would have palaces and places to stay and own land in any of these cities. So Jezreel was one of these cities. It's not a backwater village here. It's an important city. And biblically speaking, one of the biggest challenges of the Jewish people at the time, and now I'm talking about 2,700 years ago, at the time of Eliyahu Hanavi, Elijah, one of the biggest challenges that we read about in the Tanakh is idol worship. Kind of weird, doesn't really seem relevant today. But at the time, this was a big challenge. And there were prophets, Elijah is perhaps the most famous of them, whose purpose seemed to be getting the Jewish people back on track and being monotheistic Jews and not pagan Canaanites. But it was not very successful because the Canaanite culture and pagan traditions were considered cutting edge and very appealing to many Jews. And one solution was to simply be part of both, belong to a people who believe in one God, but have an idol in the back room just in case. Now, if you think I'm joking, I'm not, because in the city of Chatzor in northern Israel, archaeologists found Israelite homes during the Israelite period, and a number of these homes had hidden in a storage room on the side an idol of fertility called Astarte, which you see here. And people thought, hey, I got all my bases covered. I got the one god over here. I got the mini gods over here, but it doesn't work like that, right? You're either monotheistic or you're not. It's like being somewhat pregnant. You got to decide. So Elijah, he's on the warpath with fire and brimstone vibe. And he tries to bring the Jewish people back to the faith. And he said, this is a very famous saying that he said, How long will you keep hopping between the two thresholds? If Hashem is your God, follow Hashem. And if Baal, follow Baal. You can't do both. And he did everything he could to get people to come back to the belief in the one God, which today, we have a lot of problems with the Jewish people, but idolatry is really not one of them. Back then, this was the big thing. On the other side of the spectrum is Ahab. Okay, Ahab is the king, the major king during the time of Elijah. And in Hebrew, his name is fascinating. His name in Hebrew is Ahab, which means brother father. Now, why would you have a name brother father? If I would translate it more modern, I would say bro and father figure. Okay, because sometimes he was a child, he was just like a bro, and sometimes he was king, he was a father figure, but he moved back and forth in between the two. He was not a stable man, and he was considered according to the Tanakh, one of the most unethical kings in history, especially because he married a woman whose name is Jezebel. In Hebrew, Jezebel, which could be translated as island of dung. Obviously, these names may have been added afterwards, but it's not like the French Isabel, which means something totally different. And Jezebel is from Sidon in Lebanon, comes from a Phoenician royal family, who of course was pagan, and she brings her idol worshiping ways to Israel, and Ahab does whatever she says. Okay? The royal family of the kingdom of Israel is openly bowing down to idols and worshiping many foreign gods. What can we say to this? Oy vey. Okay? So the storyline, the most important story that everybody tells when they come to Jezreel is the following story. It's a very strange story, very dramatic, and I have mushed it into just a few lines, shortened it and paraphrased it, okay? And here it is. Ahab, the son of Omri, became the king over Israel in Shomron and reigned for 22 years. Ahab angered Hashem more than all who preceded him. He married Jezebel, daughter of the king of the Phoenicians, and he went and served Baal and worshipped him, and he built an altar to Baal in the temple of Baal, which he built in Shomron. He also had a home in the city of Israel. Navot, a man who lived in Israel, owned a vineyard adjoining the place where King Ahab of Shomron had a place in Jezreel, like a summer or a winter home. And Ahab went to Navot and said, Navot, give me your vineyard so that I can have it and make a really nice vegetable garden out of it, because it's right next to my building. And I'll give you a better vineyard in exchange. And if you prefer, I'll pay you the price in money. Now, that's something that you would do today. You have some land, you made a real estate deal, you sell it. Not back then. When you have a land that was your parents' land, you do not sell it. It's not something that people do. You stay with the land no matter what. So Navot is in a really tough place. He's talking to the king, who is all powerful. And he says to him, God forbid that I should give up to you what I've inherited from my fathers. It's like my hands are tied. I can't sell this to you. So what does Ahab do? Like a child, like an ach, okay, he goes home upset because of the answer that Navot gave him. He lied down in his bed and turned away with his face, and he would not eat. It's like a little child. I'm not going to eat because I didn't get the ball when I wanted to play my game. And this is one of the ridiculous sides of Ahab. But Jezebel comes home and sees him and says, why are you so dispirited that you won't eat? And he tells her, I spoke to Navot. I asked him to sell me his vineyard, but he refused. So Jezebel says to him, now is the time to show that you are king over Israel. In other words, will you please be a man? Will you please act like an abba, like a king? Get up, eat something, and be cheerful. I will get the vineyard of Navot for you. And without even asking him, she makes up this story that Navot cursed God and cursed the king and had two witnesses, fake witnesses, come to the court and give testimony. And they took him out and they stoned him to death. And she goes back to Navot and says, go and take possession of the vineyard, which Navot refused to sell to you for money because he's dead. And when Ahab heard that Navot was dead, he went down to the vineyard to take possession of it. But, and here's the big but, Hashem says to Elijah, go down and confront King Ahab of Israel. He is now in Navot's vineyard, and say to him, this is a very famous line, okay? Say to him, you not only murdered Navot, but you also took possession of his vineyard? Now in Hebrew, this is just 3 words. Haratzachta v'gam yarashta? Like, not enough that you killed the man, you're also going to take his property, which belongs to his family? And various painters and various graphic artists have tried to kind of portray Ahab as being kind of a silly man, like Achashverosh, or a very mean man. But it seems like he had a little bit of both, which is kind of dangerous. And as he's walking there, Elijah comes up to him and says something to him that shakes him to his very foundation. And this is what he says. Thus says Hashem, in the very place where the dogs lapped up Navot's blood, the dogs will lap up your blood too. And Hashem has also spoken concerning Jezebel. The dogs will devour Jezebel in the field of Jezreel. I'm sorry to be so gross about this, but that's what it says. And this was the worst possible thing you can say, first of all, to any human, but especially to a king. When Ahab heard these words, he rent his clothes and put sackcloth on his body. He fasted and he lay in sackcloth and walked about subdued. And Hashem said to Elijah, have you seen how Ahab has humbled himself before me? Because of this, I will not bring the disaster in his lifetime. I will bring the disaster upon his house in his son's time. And that actually is the story that everyone tells when they come to Jezreel. So let's hike already, enough talking. There's a very convenient picnic area here at the trailhead, right next to the parking lot. And if you look south, you can see the northern West Bank, or Judea and Samaria, including the huge city of Jenin. To the west, as I said before, is Mount Carmel. To the north, the valley itself, and to the east is Mount Gilboa, and afterwards Jordan. The trail is very well marked. Then let's start walking. So pretty soon, we take about 10 steps and we see all these cisterns, and they're all covered up with metal bars for safety reasons. This is a very popular trail and used often by students on their mandatory hiking days in school. In Israel, you have to go hiking. Most people are happy to get out of the class, except for the teachers. And because of that, you got kids walking around, you can't have these open pits. So the archaeologists found 68 of these bell-shaped caves in Jezreel. At first they thought they were water cisterns, but in recent years, it's assumed that many of these caves were also for storage, especially for grain. Now, a few years ago, a huge archaeological excavation took place here. How did they know where to start digging? So it turns out that this was the first place in Israel where they did something very special. This was in 2012. And before they excavated, they used a new technique known as airborne LIDAR, which is light detection and ranging. And it works by scanning the ground with a laser from an aircraft from above. And the aircraft picks up however the light is reflected and records it, not unlike a bat that gives out sonar waves, and when the waves come back, is able to understand where the bat can fly. It's not the same thing, but it's similar. And then you add to it information given by a survey team on the ground with a handheld GPS. And then you can add to it historic maps and old aerial photographs. And we had aerial photographs from World War I, when the German Air Force took pictures of the Jezreel Valley. Altogether, this technique allows the diggers to know where almost everything is. And even if there's trees above, they're able to know what's underneath. It's an incredible thing. And this is what they got. So that by really analyzing this, and this isn't really high quality, but you can imagine that, for instance, here where you see the letter T down in the valley, you can see that there were terraces here. But when you walk there, you can't see it. So this is actually, it's almost like X-raying the earth. And this way, they knew before they dug where they were going to find certain things. And now that's already 10 years later, pretty standard. So as we make our way from the top of the city down towards the valley below us, we pass various biblical signs and explanations and places to sit and look at this beautiful view below. And it turns out from the archaeologists who dug there that there were actually two Jezreels. One was royal and was on top of Tel Jezreel and kind of like an acropolis, where this between NP and M, this is where, let's say, the royal family was. And the common people lived down here near S, which is closer to the spring. And this would be, you know, there'd be guards there, and it wouldn't be just for anybody. And K is something really interesting. They found, believe it or not, a winery. Okay, so the general region around Tel Jezreel was known for generations as perfect for producing both oil and wine. And the LIDAR scans helped the team of archaeologists find 57 wine and oil olive presses. But the soil analysis showed that over here on the western side where Q is, this is good for olives. And over here where K is, the earth is good for grapes. And this brings us to the story of Navot. We know that he had a vineyard that was close to the building by Ahab up here. So it fits that right where Navot would live in S and Ahab would live over here, there would be a vineyard. And this is the high place, this is the low place. And remember what Navot did. It says Navot went down to it says Ahab went down to Navot's vineyard. So even topographically, this story fits very much the biblical story, but now we have to be scientists and be like an archaeologist. And here we go to timing, okay? Up here, the buildings that they found, the royal buildings were from the 9th century before the Common Era, okay? That's a little less than 3,000 years ago. Fits perfectly the time of Ahab. Okay, here is the kibbutz on the right. Tel Jezreel, where the royal area was. The winery is over here. You have to go down to get to it. The winery and the vineyard. Now here they found a 40 dunam, huge winery. This is a place for stomping on grapes that grew in the vineyards nearby. And these holes, and there's scores of them, were to put the pitchers where the wine or the grape juice was sitting. And the pits are to put some of the pitchers so that they will ferment. And this, you can't really date something that's made out of stone, right? How can we find when they did this? We can't, but luckily, there's something that we know. For instance, we know that where there's a winery, there's going to be a vineyard nearby. Even today, this is a picture from Italy. This is a picture from the United States. Okay, a winery is going to be in the vineyard. This is a picture from Israel in the mountains of near Jerusalem. Okay, there's a winery right there because the farmers will tell you that one of the important things in the quality of wine is the short amount of time it takes to get the grapes after they're picked from the vineyard to the winery. The closer it is, the better quality the wine will be. That makes sense also thousands of years ago. And here, where the juice, the grape juice flowed to, if they wouldn't have plastered it, it would have been absorbed by the rock. But back then they plastered it. And so they were able to actually take the plaster and find the pollen. I know it sounds insane, but they were actually able within the plaster to find the pollen and know what plants were growing there and could time it. And the last time it was used was the 1st century of the Common Era. That doesn't tell us when it was started. But by comparing it to other similar wineries that we have all over Israel, it is according to the archaeologists, from the 9th century before the Common Era, fitting the story perfectly. And the lower Jezreel is this area here, right next to the spring, which is where all the trees are. And this is the end of the hike. When we get to the trees at the bottom, we get to this beautiful pool, which in the winter is full, and it lasts sometimes into the spring and the beginning of the summer, and kids just jump in. It's not too deep. During the British Mandate, they put some pumps here to take the water out, and there's a little tunnel that kids can go through if nobody's watching, and they can walk through, and it's kind of cool. So as it were, that would be the end of the hike, but of course it can't be the end of the hike, because as Aaron said, it's leave no tradition to try to understand Jewish values from wherever we're hiking. By definition, a leave no hike is also an educational opportunity to teach these Jewish values. So I want to return for a moment to the meeting of Elijah and Ahab. And I want to again note that Ahab is officially king and Elijah is the prophet, okay? The king is almighty, okay? He can do whatever he wants, okay? And Elijah is usually considered a nudnik by the people that he or she is trying to help become a better person. So Jeremiah, for instance, when he told the king that he should do Aleph instead of Bet, he got thrown in prison. And Jezebel actually tried to kill Elijah. He simply escaped to the desert. Why didn't Ahab kill him? He could have killed him. Nobody would have known, just like he killed Naphot. He could have doctored it. He could have killed him. But something happened when he told them that terrible dog-related prophecy, okay? This man, of course, is described as being one of the most unethical kings ever to reign in Israel. And his wife committed perjury and murder just to gain real estate. He built temples for idol worship. He encouraged others to be pagan, but for some unknown reason, Ahab allowed Elijah's word to sink into his soul. And when Elijah and Hashem fling his punishment into his face, something happened to Ahab's kishkis. Something broke inside of him. And he took these words to heart and he began to change his ways. Ahab seems to have sparks of goodness in him. He just needs help in bringing them out. He had the power to kill Elijah, and his wife tried. But as opposed to his wife, Ahab actually had great potential for doing good. When his wife had his ear, he's evil. When Elijah has his ear, he's good. Now let's go back to just a few days ago, we read Megillat Esther. When Haman has Achashvero's ear, he's willing to kill the entire people. He doesn't even know that they're Jewish. He says, sure, yeah, go ahead, kill them. When Esther has Achashvero's ear, he kills Haman and all of his sons. And perhaps one of the things we can learn from this is that a leader needs to surround his or herself with good ethical people. And this is true also for any leader of a family. And it's true even for every single human. We need to have a moral compass next to us. We cannot rely only on our own judgment because we get swayed. We are not islands unto ourselves. We are influenced consciously and unconsciously by the people around us. And therefore, we should try to surround ourselves with the kind of people we'd like to become. But the sages went one step further and said something mind-bending about the character traits of the Jewish people during the reign of Ahab. And this is from the Midrash, and I want to read it to you and have it sink in, because it's very counterintuitive. Rabbi Shmuel Bar Nachman said, Ahab's generation was full of pagan idol worshippers, but they would win all their wars. And why is this? Because there weren't any speakers of Lashon Hara among them. This is one of the most powerful things ever written in the Talmud. I just have to say it again. It's too powerful. Ahab's generation was full of pagan idol worshippers, but they would win all their wars. And why is this? Because there weren't any speakers of Lashon Hara among them. Now, we're given the first impression that bowing down to idols and acting like pagans is positively the worst thing in the world that a Jewish person can do. But Rabbi Shmuel says, no, you're mistaken. He teaches us that the way we act towards our fellow humans is seemingly more important than the way we act towards Hashem. That is a break from regular Jewish understanding. And I think this is important to remember when teaching young Jewish people about the basic tenets of Judaism. And when working at a place like Livnot, where young Jews come often to build their own Jewish selves. And this has been really Livnot's educational outlook ever since Aaron and Miriam started the program in 1980. And when I came, it was already there. First, we learn about interpersonal relationships with a big emphasis on how we speak about other humans. And later, much later, down the line, we bring up the relationship between ourselves and the divine. If we were not to do this, we would be guilty of trying to build a house without a foundation. We'd be teaching about a religion that seems to focus on our relationship to Hashem first and foremost, and then later, down the line, move on to the secondary subject, which is our relationship to other humans. And I want to finish with a story to emphasize how dangerous this can be educationally. And it's something that happened, and I tell every single Livnot group that I meet, because I think it's very important to remember, and it's a very Livnotish idea. It's a true story. Our family was in Jerusalem, and my son, who was about 5 at the time, he'd never been to the Kotel. So he said, can we go to the Kotel? What, are you going to say no? Of course we're going to go. So we went, and my son and I were walking hand in hand towards the wall. And I could see this little boy of 5 was totally in awe of this wall and all that was going on around it. And then as we're getting closer to the wall, suddenly a man comes running behind us and just crashes straight into us as he was running to the Kotel. And I went flying one way. And my son, who was about the size of a toothpick, went flying the other way. And when he got up, he was whimpering, why did he knock me down? I didn't do anything to him. And then we just stood there and watched this man run straight to the Kotel and start swaying and praying. And I thought to myself, we were just in the way. He was so connected to Hashem, he didn't even see us humans. We were just in his way. We were obstacles. He was so spiritual, so connected to the divine, and humans were just objects to overcome. And this is why we need to teach our kids and the young Jews of the world that the baseline of Jewish jazz, as it were, is how we treat our fellow humans. That's the foundation. And the harmony, or the dessert, that's our relationship to Hashem. That's the second story. And if we were to build a building with just the second floor with no foundation, it wouldn't last. But if we start by building the first foundation, the way we treat humans, and on top of it, build another building, we can have a stable relationship with the divine. Now, it could be, we're supposed to judge people favorably. Maybe this man's mother was about to undergo open heart surgery, and he felt that he could save her life. And he had no time to lose. And in that case, I totally understand why he knocked us down on his way to prayer. No problem. I forgive you. But if it wasn't the case, I'm really worried, because knocking down humans on the way to Hashem, that's not our Jewish tradition. And Abraham, there's a great story that he was having a conversation with Hashem. And when guests came to his tent, he stopped the conversation with Hashem and welcomed the guest into his tent. And that is our tradition. So Yisrael, in all of its beauty and history and farming, is also an excellent spot for teaching Jewish values. And that is what Livnot is all about. If anybody has any questions, feel free to ask, or comments, or maybe you've been there before or something.
Thank you so much, Michael. It was
Yeah.
uh,
Thank you.
I'm looking forward to all the classes, to the book.
Mhm.
And listen, we have now an opportunity of bringing thousands of people to leave a note. The fact that that we do this birthright extension, we've been doing it for 5 years. Before COVID, for 5 years, we were the official spiritual extension. And now we're the only ones left out of the 6 options. So now we have an opportunity of really letting many people have a taste of Jewish values and nature, with Michael too.
Excellent.
תודה רבה.
Mhm.
Toda rabah. That was excellent.
Thank you.
I hope you all
Excellent. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very
Is
much.
this-
Have a
yes, this
Shavua
was
Tov.
recorded. This was recorded, so I can tell my family
this
they
is
can watch
recorded.
it.
And please tell Jill that we'd love to see her in Tzfat. That
Uh,
it's, to come to Israel and not come to Tzfat is, she hasn't been here for a while. And all of you, you're all invited to Tzfat.
Of course.
And
Do you know her son is in Israel too?
no, I didn't.
Yeah, he took a
What?
gap year. He's at Shalom Hartman.
Oh, yeah. I think she told me that. That's right. Okay, good. Okay, we have a
Wonderful.
program in Pesach. So anyone, if you know anyone in Israel that'd like to come to us, we'd love to host them. And we start programs in the summer on a regular basis.
Okay.
Okay, Shavua Tov.
Thank you, Michael.
Thank you, Michael.
Shavua tov. Okay, bye-bye.
Bye.
Andrea, you're trying to say something and you're muted.
Oh,
No, Andrea, can you hear?
are you talking to me?
Yeah. I'm
Oh, no,
trying-
I wasn't. I was just saying thank you. I really enjoyed it.
Okay.
Yeah, it was a great program. Very enjoyable. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay,
Bye-bye.
bye-bye, bye-bye. Simona, hi. Hi, Ivana. Come visit us. Where are you at, Simona? Where are you at? In you're you're not in Israel, right?
No,
You're in Norway?
I'm in Denmark. I'm in
Denmark.
Copenhagen.
Oh, you know what? Oh my gosh, someone just asked me if we know someone in Denmark.
Oh,
Oh, so you do me a favor, send me an email right now, okay? And
Okay.
with the phone number, and let me give them, hi.
yeah. Okay, I'll send you an
Nicole.
email.
Nicole, great to see you.
We're definitely here due to
Yeah.
COVID.
Okay. Nicole, what number were you on? Were you on the program? What number were you on? Do you remember?
Yeah, I don't know. What was it? 80.
Was it
I was in the
six?
fall program
No, but your first program,
in the fall,
4.
the 3-month one from like September to December in 87.
No, that's not 4.
No,
No, you did.
No, I was in
You
87.
did before 87. You did like 82, 83, right?
No, 87.
Well, I don't know. I got to
I
get
was
out.
87. I was 21.
please.
I was just finished university. It was 87.
Yeah. Okay. Good.
A
Okay.
3-month,
Okay. Yeah.
3-month
Okay.
program.
That's right. Okay. 22 or something like that.
Yeah,
You were-
somewhere
you were
20
Susie.
something. Yeah.
I think
I
you
can't
were
remember what
Susie, right? Okay. I gotta go.
Okay.
Anyway, thank you for the
send me
lovely
your
talks.
address, okay?
Okay, I'll send
Send
you
me
an
your
email. Have a good week,
Okay.
Shavua Tov,
Okay.
and thank
Okay.
you.
Bye-bye.